In June 1944, Europe lay under the boots of an empire convinced of its own invincibility. From the tip of Norway to the Spanish border, stretching 2,400 miles, Nazi Germany's Atlantic Wall was promoted as a steel shield against any landing. According to statistics from the TOT organization, they had used 17 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.2 million tons of steel for this construction. Propaganda magazines published images of massive bunkers, steel stakes jutting into the sea, and deep tunnels adorned with swastika flags, symbols of absolute mechanical might. In reports sent to Berlin, the phrase "impenetrable defense" was repeated like a mantra. In Rommel's office, the defense maps of Normandy were marked in red ink, each position no more than 1,000 meters apart. He once told his officers, "If they come, we will greet them with steel." Yet behind that facade lay a fractured command system. Across Western Europe, there were 58 divisions, but most were reconstituted units, short of both manpower and weapons. According to the OKW General Staff's report, more than 30% of the troops in Normandy's defensive divisions were older men or foreign conscripts from Eastern Europe. Half of the defensive artillery pieces were captured guns from France or Czechoslovakia, with incompatible ammunition and weak radio communication. The strategic reserve forces were fragmented into scattered panzer groups under Hitler's direct control, meaning that every counterattack order had to pass through layers of approval in Berlin. Former Lieutenant Colonel Rudolf Steiger of the 352nd Division later testified at Nuremberg, "We had concrete walls, but no telephone wire long enough to call the artillery." On May 30, Erwin Rommel left his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon to inspect the WN-62 defense sector at Omaha Beach. The weather was foggy, the sea calm, the yellow sand stretching to the horizon. He examined each machine gun nest and each trench line meticulously, then said, "This beach will be their cemetery." The statement echoed like the prophecy of a warlord, but it was also the last echo of blind faith. According to the diary of Major Fritz Ziegelmann, Rommel ordered that every meter of coastline must have at least 4 layers of obstacles: anti-tank mines, inverted wooden stakes, and steel hedgehogs. By June, the Omaha area had been fitted with more than 3,700 obstacles within the tidal zone. German officers believed that if even one landing craft touched the shore, the entire area would become a graveyard of steel. Meanwhile, at higher levels, the war was being guided by intuition. German generals argued over the landing site. Hitler believed it would be at Pas de Calais, the closest point to England, while Rundstedt and Rommel insisted that Normandy was the true target. Orders for construction and ammunition distribution were delayed for weeks. The more they trusted the wall, the slower the German war machine reacted. "We had built a monument to our own overconfidence," wrote General Hans Speidel in his 1949 memoir. On the night of June 4, the Luftwaffe Meteorological Office in Paris issued a weather report: winds of 20-25 knots, waves 6 feet high, clouds at 500 feet, and no possibility for an invasion in the next 2 weeks. The report caused the entire command chain to relax its vigilance. Rommel left the front to return to Germany for his wife's birthday, bringing with him a pair of grey leather shoes he had bought in Paris. Several divisional commanders were granted leave, and troops rotated to the rear. Even the E-boat patrols in the English Channel were allowed to cancel their night missions due to bad weather. In the fortifications, coastal guns were covered with tarps to prevent salt corrosion, and ammunition crates were sealed shut. But on the other side, the British saw the opposite. According to the Meteorological Office report by Group Captain James Stagg, weather stations in Greenland and the North Atlantic had detected a 36-hour window of calm pressure. After hearing the report, Eisenhower simply said, "We go." With that command, 7,000 ships began leaving English ports through the night. As the German searchlights dimmed along the Normandy coast, the massive fleet silently advanced into the black waters before dawn. At dawn on the 6th of June 1944, soldiers in the coastal bunkers of Normandy awoke to an eerie silence. The waves sounded the same, no unusual signals appeared. They made coffee, checked their ammunition, and looked out over the dark sea. A sense of safety filled the air, a calm comfort before the storm. And in that stillness, as the clock struck 5:30, the Freya radar began to register the first blips. A young officer reported to his superior, voice trembling, "There's something out there." The answer was silence, then the slow wail of warning sirens through the morning mist. Somewhere inside bunker WN62, soldier Hinrich Seel cleaned the barrel of his MG42, attending to every detail. In his breast pocket was a letter from his lover in Metzingen, promising to wait until the final victory. He looked up at the tranquil ocean, unaware that in just a few hours, the world he knew would shatter. The Empire believed in its wall of concrete, but it had forgotten that no wall can stand against a storm made of industry. And in that silence, the first wave was already coming. When the clock struck 5:30 a.m. on the 6th of June 1944, the Freya radar at the observation post near Pointe du Hoc detected the first bright spots. On the static flickering screen, hundreds of signals appeared, forming a streak stretching from west to east. The officer on duty, Lieutenant Hans Berman, immediately sent a report to headquarters. Unidentified targets approaching from the north. The reply he received a few minutes later was, possibly an exercise or radar interference. But as the band of signals thickened, the screen turned into a solid mass. According to the records of the Wehrmacht Signal Corps, only 10 minutes later, the signals covered the entire Normandy coastline. As the fog began to lift, the German observers witnessed a scene beyond imagination. From the horizon, a strip of steel and smoke stretched endlessly, reflecting the dawn light upon the waves. It was not dozens or hundreds of ships. It was 6,939 vessels, including 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 auxiliary ships, and 864 merchant vessels. Major Bernhard Firking, commander of an artillery company at WN62, wrote in his diary, "When the first light touched the sea, we saw the world coming toward us." The young soldiers peered through their binoculars in silence. They had been taught that the English Channel was a natural line of defence, but what unfolded before their eyes was a floating city, moving in perfect unison. Inside the bunkers, radio chatter surged as officers shouted to adjust firing coordinates. "Feuerbereit," ready to fire. The order echoed through the internal communication lines. At headquarters, General Wilhelm Richter of the 716th Division tried to remain calm as the reports came flooding in. Enemy landing along the entire front, with full force. A witness later recounted, "Everyone went silent. No one could believe the scale was real. Then, as the clock struck 5:35, the sky suddenly lit up. The Allied fleet opened fire simultaneously. The USS Texas, anchored off Pointe du Hoc, fired 255 shells of 14-inch caliber in just 34 minutes. According to the Naval History and Heritage Command report, each shell weighed nearly 640 kilograms, generating enough pressure to collapse reinforced concrete bunkers. To the east, the HMS Warspite began its bombardment at 5, firing 315 shells of 15-inch caliber in the first 2 days, 96 shells on June 9 alone. The explosions rolled along the coast, and the ground shook as if struck by an earthquake. The bunkers, once designed to withstand heavy bombardment, now cracked open. Iron doors bent, ventilation systems crushed. A surviving gunner at WN64 recalled after the war, "The sand in our mouths turned to mud from blood and gunpowder smoke. From afar, columns of water tens of meters high rose as shells struck the sea, obscuring all vision." Meanwhile, observers reported the collapse of the first artillery line. According to records from the German Federal Archives, 60% of Omaha's coastal defense positions were destroyed within the first 20 minutes. German officers tried to call for counter-battery fire, but the telephone lines were cut. The command base in Caen had lost contact with coastal units. Chaos began to spread, each bunker becoming an isolated world. In the skies above, the symbol that once terrified all of Europe had become a ghost. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated the skies in 1940, now had nothing left but a few hundred exhausted pilots and a severe fuel shortage. According to the U.S. Navy Office of Naval Intelligence, on June 6, the Luftwaffe conducted 319 sorties, facing 14,674 Allied sorties. When ordered to attack the landing fleet, Oberst Joseph Pips Priller, commander of JG-26, asked his superior, "What entire force? I have 2 planes." And indeed, he had only 2 FW-190A8 seconds. They took off from Lille, dove over Sword Beach, fired short bursts, then retreated when dozens of Spitfires closed in. That was the entirety of Germany's air resistance that morning. A post-war report recorded, "And in that silence, the Luftwaffe died." In the defense positions, the thunder of naval guns mixed with the cries of soldiers buried under sand. At WN-62, Firking shouted into the radio, "They're closing in! Thousands of landing craft advancing!" But no one could hear him. Many units believed they were fighting against the entire world. According to the U.S. Army Center of Military History, for every German artillery salvo fired, the American fleet responded with 3 more accurate bombardments, lasting for hours. As the LCT and LCI landing fleets began lowering their ramps, the sea seemed to split in 2, and thousands of American, British, and Canadian soldiers advanced at once. German observation posts were engulfed in smoke and fire, unable to determine where the front line even was. By 6:15, General Richter reported to the 7th Army Command in Le Mans, "The situation is uncontrollable. The enemy is landing on an unprecedented scale." For years, they had believed that the strength of the Reich lay in its fortresses, in steel and concrete. Now, all of it was meaningless before the sheer numbers. 6,939 ships, 14,674 sorties, and firepower beyond all tactical calculation. That was the moment faith shattered. A young Austrian officer, who survived Normandy, later wrote in his memoir, "We thought war was about guns and courage, but that morning we realized it was about fuel, assembly lines, and production." As the thick smoke spread across the sea, many German soldiers collapsed not from wounds but from sheer shock. From absolute confidence, they fell into silence, then despair. The invasion had begun, and the Reich entered what history would call the paralysis of faith. In that brief morning, every illusion of strength dissolved with the thunder of the guns echoing from the horizon. At 6:35 a.m., on the morning of the 6th of June 1944, on the hillside overlooking Omaha Beach, Sergeant Hinrich Seel placed his hand on the stock of his MG-42 and pulled the trigger. The first sound tore through the thin mist, dry, shrill, echoing off the concrete walls. According to his memoir, WN-62, Erinnerungen an Omaha Beach, published in 2005, he fired 13,500 rounds in 9 hours, changing barrels 3 times due to overheating. Each bullet left the MG-42's muzzle at 1,200 rounds per minute, enough to shred everything in sight. Below, the landing craft doors opened. American soldiers surged onto the sand and fell in rows. Through Seel's binoculars, the sea turned into a tableau of mud, water, and blood. He recalled, "We could no longer tell who was who. We just saw movement, and we fired." The defensive system where Seel fought was part of the WN-62 strongpoint, a position rated by the Wehrmacht as the most fortified in the Omaha sector. According to the U.S. Army Center of Military History, the entire area contained 8 concrete bunkers, 35 pillboxes, 85 machine gun nests, 6 mortar pits, and 3,700 obstacles in the tidal zone, most fitted with Teller anti-tank mines. Each entrance was reinforced with steel bolts, and the bunkers were connected by tunnels buried deep beneath the rock. But when the Allied fleet began bombarding the hillside, sand and steel lost all meaning. The German soldiers hidden in the bunkers felt the ground tremble as if alive. According to the German Federal Archives, within the first 20 minutes, 60% of WN-62's firing positions were damaged, and 3 machine gun nests were buried under sand. When the first salvo from the battleship Texas exploded near the bunker's edge, Seel was stunned, blood flooding his ears. He turned to see his comrades, some collapsed, others half buried under the mix of earth and concrete. but the MG-42 was still intact, and Seel pulled the trigger again. He fired until his hands went numb, his skin blistering from the gun's heat. American fire kept pounding the hillside, yet each time the barrage paused, he could hear the screams of the landing troops below. For a moment he realized that the shapes kept moving forward, wave after wave. "I understood then that they would not stop, no matter how much we fired," he wrote. The U.S. Army after-action report recorded casualties at Omaha on the first day as 2,400 men, including dead, wounded, and missing. Most of these losses occurred under fire from WN-62. Meanwhile, Seel and his 26 men had nearly exhausted their ammunition by midday. According to the Wehrmacht supply log, the 3-day reserve calculated for 15,000 rounds was spent within 4 hours. The supporting 75mm artillery guns to the rear received orders to conserve shells, 4 rounds per gun per day. By 11 a.m., only one remained operational. Captain Bernhard Freking, Seel's direct commander, reported, "No ammunition, no reinforcements." From that point, the defensive positions were completely isolated. On the hill, smoke grew thick, the smell of gunpowder and blood mixing into one. The soldiers inside the bunkers began coughing up blood from smoke and a lack of oxygen. "The sand in my mouth tasted metallic," Seel recalled. A comrade named Weber tried to change the spare barrel, his hands trembling from heat, the skin scorched. He asked, "How many of them do you think there are?" Seel replied, "Enough to replace every man they lose." It was the first moment he realized that the battle had moved beyond human scale. By 14, as naval bombardment paused to let Allied infantry advance, WN-62 was nearly cut off. The communication tunnels had collapsed, and the internal phone system was silent. The survivors passed ammunition boxes and canteens by hand. In his memoir, Seel wrote, "We began to hear English mixed with German. I realized they were right at the foot of the hill. A group of American soldiers crawled across the tidal flats, hugging the ground, throwing grenades into the firing slits. Flares flashed repeatedly, turning human figures into blurred shadows through the smoke. A young German soldier broke down, sobbing and praying under his breath. According to the U.S. Navy operational summary, American destroyers at that point moved to within 800 meters of shore to provide direct fire support, an unprecedented act of risk. Each ship fired an average of 300 heavy shells, leveling every remaining bunker. Sand exploded upward, earth collapsed, and the sea shimmered red. Seel was blown from his position by the blast, tumoring into a trench, losing consciousness for several minutes. When he awoke, the gunfire had thinned. Around him lay his comrades, many motionless. These were the men who had fought for 9 hours to hold a position that history would later call the Hell of Omaha. By the end of the day, WN-62 officially fell. According to the German 352nd Infantry Division report, only 3 out of 27 soldiers at that position survived. They were captured amid an estimated 13,500 shell casings scattered around the MG-42. In post-war interrogation, Seel said, "I fired until the last round, but ahead of me, they were still coming. They came like water, endless, tireless. As the sun set, smoke still rose from the hill, the sea glimmering with metal and burning oil. In the distance, the next wave of landing craft approached, filled with weapons, supplies, and fuel. From above, the burned wrecks of earlier boats lay among hundreds of new ones. It was the image of a law of war the Germans had never understood. Courage and skill could not defeat an infinite system of production. On that first day of the invasion, on Omaha Beach, soldiers like Seel faced a new kind of weapon, not bombs or bullets, but the power of limitless replacement. And when the smoke cleared, the silence that followed was not victory. It was a realization. While the gunfire on Omaha Beach still echoed, behind the lines, the German command posts descended into unprecedented chaos. At 5:30, Major General Hans von Luck, commander of the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 21st Panzer Division, received the first reports of Allied paratroopers appearing around the Seine area. He immediately requested permission to launch a counterattack, but the order from Corps headquarters was clear: Do not move until the situation is clarified. In his post-war memoir, Panzer Commander, von Luck wrote, "At that moment, I knew we were lost. The paratroopers were marking the flanks for an invasion, and we were ordered to wait. That delayed order became the death sentence for the entire Normandy defensive system. At the 7th Army headquarters in Le Mans, the telephones rang incessantly. Reports from the coast came in fragmented, jammed, or cut off midway. General Friedrich Dollmann, the corps commander, struggled to gather data to determine the scale of the landing, but all signals contradicted one another. Some units reported that the enemy is attacking at Pas de Calais, while others described thousands of ships appearing off the Normandy coast. The German command structure, dependent on wired communications and relay centres, was now shattered. According to the German Communications War Report 1944, by 9, more than 60% of communication lines along the Saint-Bayeux axis had been destroyed by shelling and the actions of the French resistance. In Paris, the General Staff received a weather report from the Luftwaffe confirming Force 5 winds and low cloud cover. They believed this was still part of a deception raid. At the same time, Rommel was still in Germany, more than 900 kilometers from the front, on an overnight train returning from his wife's birthday. He only learned of the invasion around 10 a.m. when an urgent telegram was delivered. In the diary of Chief of Staff Hans Speidel, it was written, "No one has the authority to order the panzer forces into action without the Führer's approval." Every counterattack decision had to await direct authorization from Berlin, where Hitler was still asleep after a night of work. According to the Wehrmacht Command Diary, the first order for the 21st Panzer Division was issued at 15, nearly 10 hours later than von Luck's initial request. The tanks began moving at 16:20, advancing along the Caen-Luc-sur-Mer axis toward the sea. By 19, they encountered British units near Lyon-sur-Mer. The counterattack unfolded in chaos. The units lacked reconnaissance, had outdated maps, and their routes were cut off by destroyed bridges. According to the Divisional Action Report, the 21st Panzer Division lost 54 tanks and armoured vehicles, equivalent to 25% of its strength, in just a few hours. When they reached the edge of the shore, the horizon lit up once again with hundreds of Allied ships. Overhead, flares from transport aircraft illuminated the sky as 250 gliders of Operation Mallard began landing, carrying 6,000 British paratroopers. Von Luck recorded, "We thought they were parachutes. Then we saw gliders. An entire army was landing behind us." He ordered a withdrawal before his forces were completely cut off. Throughout the afternoon, German radio transmissions were heavily jammed. The Allied Electronic Warfare Unit had deployed jamming waves in the 30-40 MHz range, blocking most tactical communication channels. The 7th Army Signals Office reported, "By noon our network collapsed entirely. Units acted without coordination." By 12 noon, all communication between the 84th Corps and the 7th Army headquarters was severed. A German signal officer later recounted, "We heard the Americans on our own frequency, talking to each other, saying they were already on the shore." From Caen, General Wilhelm Richter of the 716th Division sent his final report before losing contact. Division combat strength 35%, all coastal strongpoints lost, artillery 90% destroyed, enemy advancing inland. The words were dry, but they marked the moment the Normandy defensive system disintegrated. According to estimates from the US Army Intelligence Summary, within 12 hours, German units along the coast had lost 70% of their direct command capacity, with many companies operating without knowledge of one another's positions. That evening, Rommel returned to headquarters at La Roche-Guyon. He looked at the map, covered with red dots marking the landing sites. "It is already too late," he said. "The counterattack that never came." The room fell silent. Another report arrived. The 21st Panzer was retreating, the bridge over the Orne River destroyed, supply lines completely cut. From that moment on, no panzer force remained capable of reaching the sea. According to the post-war analysis of the British Army Operational Research Section, on June 6 alone, Germany could have mobilised 300 tanks in northern France, but due to command bottlenecks and fuel shortages, Fewer than one-third entered combat. British military experts called it the paralysis of command. A chain reaction of delays stripped every decision of its timing, and in war, losing time means losing everything. As night fell, the roads around Caen were engulfed in smoke. Burning tanks lined the roadsides, mechanized crews were scattered, and the radios fell silent. Von Luck gathered the remaining survivors around a ruined house. He sat facing the sea, where flares still lit the horizon as bright as day. One officer asked, "Are we going to counterattack, sir?" Von Luck replied, "We already missed the only hour that mattered." It was the summary of a bitter truth. From the bloody tactical level at WN62, the war rose to the operational level and collapsed in the hands of its own bureaucracy. The German command machine, once praised for its speed and precision, was now paralyzed by the very rules it had created. And on that first evening of D-Day, every plan for a counterattack dissolved into the sound of waves echoing beneath a burning sky. After June 6, the war in Normandy was no longer a clash between men, but between two systems of production. On the Allied side, victory did not rest on individual battles but on a chain of factories, machine shops, and supply lines stretching from North America to Britain. On the German side, every counterattack order was drained away within a collapsing network, according to the US Army Center of Military History. Within the first 24 hours, the Allies had unloaded more than 15,000 tons of supplies, fuel, ammunition, and food. That figure far exceeded what the entire Wehrmacht in Normandy could consume in a week. General Speidel, reviewing post-war reports, wrote, "It was not a battle of soldiers, but of supply columns. On the beaches of Utah and Omaha, hundreds of LSTs opened their doors, lowering their steel ramps onto the sand. Shermans, GMCs, and fuel trucks rolled out of their hulls like an unending river of steel. Behind them, American engineers constructed the Mulberry artificial harbors, each concrete block weighing thousands of tons, towed from Britain and assembled into floating piers. In just 10 days, Mulberry could receive 4,000 ships per month, a throughput equal to that of a major commercial port, according to the US Naval Construction Battalion records. These ports processed more than 1.3 million tons of materials within 2 months, a feat unprecedented in naval history. Meanwhile, on the other side, Germany's transport system was collapsing. The SS Das Reich Division, stationed in Toulouse, received orders to move to Normandy for a counterattack. The 800-kilometre journey, which should have taken 3 days, took 17. According to the Wehrmacht Transportation Report, July 1944, during this movement, Das Reich lost 30% of its vehicles to air attacks. The rest broke down, ran out of fuel, or were sabotaged by the resistance. Every 10 kilometres, a bridge was down or a railway destroyed. Allied pilots called the route from Loire to Le Mans the Corridor of Fire. A German officer wrote in his diary, "We did not fight. We just burned." Behind the Allies' logistical success stood the colossal industrial power of the United States. In 1944, according to the US War Production Board final report, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft, 49,000 tanks, and 2.7 million military trucks. The Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan turned out one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At General Motors plants, aircraft engines were mass-produced, each completed in under 48 hours. These figures were not just statistics, they were declarations of war from industry itself. They manufactured victory, as one American military economist put it. This unbridgeable disparity showed in every small detail. While each U.S. division could deploy 300 GMC trucks daily to carry ammunition and fuel, a German division at the same time had only 40 operational trucks, most shared among regiments. According to the German Army Fuel Logistics Memo, the average fuel consumption of an American division was 700,000 litres per day, roughly equal to the entire synthetic fuel output of Germany in one day. By July 1944, the German High Command reported that 85% of oil depots in France and Belgium had been destroyed by air raids. Panther and Tiger tanks were abandoned by the roadside for lack of fuel, then blown up during retreats. On the beaches, Allied logistics ran like an unbroken production line. In the morning, cargo ships docked. By noon, trucks hauled shells inland. By afternoon, new pontoon bridges were laid. By night, the next convoys had already left Plymouth. No pause. No gaps. According to the Royal Engineers Operation Report, from June 7 to June 30, the total tonnage unloaded at Normandy reached 476,000 tons, including 83,000 tons of fuel and 320,000 tons of ammunition. Every item was coded, moved to its exact place, at the exact time. It was the mathematics of war, where every bullet, barrel, and steel plate fit precisely into a calculated equation. For Germany, that equation was unsolvable. The Leuna synthetic fuel plant, the Wehrmacht's main supplier, was bombed on May 12, reducing production by 80%. Rail lines around Rouen, Amiens, and Caen were severed. From June onward, no supply train moved in daylight. According to the Luftwaffe Transport Command archive, air cargo missions dropped from 1,200 per month to 200. General Alfred Jodl, in an internal report to Berlin, wrote tersely, "The front starves not for courage, but for fuel." The contrast in logistics was clearest in the smallest engagements. When American troops called for artillery by radio, shells arrived within 3 minutes. When German troops called, the signal was jammed, or the guns had no ammunition left. When the Allies lost a tank, a replacement arrived within 24 hours. When Germany lost a Tiger, replacement took 6 weeks, if the factory had not already been bombed. A report by the British Operational Research Section concluded, every logistical failure of the Wehrmacht multiplied the Allies' strength. As the sun set over beaches crowded with containers, oil smoke still rose from the new supply depots. American engineers and mechanics stood watching their creation like a vast machine running smoothly. A combat engineer sergeant wrote home, "It felt like we were building a city that could move." On the other side, in the command bunker at Caen, Speidel looked down at a map littered with red marks and sighed, "They have turned war into an industry." And indeed, the battlefield of Normandy proved a bitter truth. In the industrial age, the gun was no longer the ultimate weapon the factory was. The production lines of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Birmingham decided the outcome of the war. In Normandy, it was not only the German soldiers who were crushed, but also the belief that man could triumph over the machine. The mathematics of war, as the Americans called it, changed everything. And in that equation, Germany had already lost before the calculation began. As the gunfire at Omaha faded, the war in Normandy entered a new phase, a phase in which victory was no longer measured by meters of ground or the number of guns, but by the ability to survive one more day. Throughout June 1944, German forces tried to reorganize their defensive lines around Cotentin and Caen, but every effort was crushed under relentless firepower and shortages. On June 13, in the small village of Villers-Bocage, a German tank commander named Michael Wittmann recorded the most famous battle of his career. With his Tiger tank No. 007, Wittmann ambushed a British armoured column, destroying 13 to 14 tanks, 15 troop carriers, and 2 anti-tank guns in just 15 minutes. According to the British Army War Diary, the attack caused the British convoy to retreat in panic, but the pride did not last. In the report sent by the Wehrmacht to Berlin, the conclusion read simply, "Tactical victory, strategic defeat." At the same time that Wittmann fired his first shot at Villers-Bocage, the situation in the north was growing dire. The port city of Cherbourg, where the Wehrmacht had been ordered to hold to the last bullet, was surrounded by the US 7th Corps under General Collins. For 5 days, from June 21 to 26, German forces fought in exhaustion, with no reinforcements and artillery shells reduced to 20% of their standard supply. According to the U.S. Army Operational Report, American artillery fired over 40,000 heavy shells into the defensive fortresses. When the last stronghold fell, 21,000 German soldiers in the city were forced to surrender. General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, who who had vowed never to capitulate, was escorted to the American command post. In the interrogation record, he quietly said, "Resistance became meaningless." It was not an excuse. It was an admission that the war had moved beyond the limits of human endurance. On other fronts, orders to hold your ground became hollow echoes in the void. German soldiers fought without maps, without ammunition, without reinforcements. According to the German Army Situation Report, by early July, 80% of the defensive units around Caen had fallen below half strength. Towns were leveled, bridges vanished, and supply lines were impossible to maintain. Rommel sent an urgent message to Berlin: "We are fighting an army equipped by continents." He was severely wounded on July 17 when his command car was bombed, and when Normandy's oldest commander left the battlefield, the entire system collapsed into a vacuum. The peak of disintegration came in mid-August in the Falaise pocket. From August 12 to 21, 1,944, more than 100,000 German soldiers were trapped in an area only 15 kilometers wide between Argentan and Trun. Allied artillery and air forces bombarded them continuously for 10 days. According to the Allied intelligence report, within the Falaise pocket, there were at least 10,000 dead, 50,000 captured, 300 tanks, and 2,500 vehicles destroyed. A surviving German sergeant recalled, "We drove over the dead because the road was made of them." That image was captured in Canadian Army footage, kilometers of road covered with bodies of men and horses, black smoke rising from burning tanks. When the Canadians closed the encirclement, German generals tried to break through but were stopped by American artillery. On the night of August 20, heavy rain fell as the survivors fled through mud and blood. The next morning, Falaise was silent, according to the U.S. Army Center of Military History. From June 6 to the 31st of August 1944, German forces in Normandy suffered 320,000 casualties, 30,000 killed, 80,000 wounded, and 210,000 missing or captured. Nearly all tanks in northern France, 2,300 vehicles were destroyed. 2,127 aircraft were shot down or lost. Meanwhile, factories in Germany suffered heavy bombing, cutting production by 50%. These figures were no longer statistics but proof of a single truth. The war had reached the outer limit of endurance. Amid the ruins, morale collapsed faster than the front lines. In Caen, German soldiers burned their notebooks and tore insignia from their uniforms to avoid recognition. A soldier of the 12th SS Division wrote in his diary, "We no longer believe in the Reich, only in surviving the night." Prisoners, when brought to temporary camps, were given milk and bread, things they had not seen for weeks. One man burst into tears as he held a cup of milk, whispering, "It tastes like home." Oh, at the command level, chaos turned into despair. The final report from General Speidel, dated August 25, stated, "No organized front remains, units are scattered, communications impossible." That same day, Paris rose and was liberated. By the end of August, every German withdrawal route in northern France was cut off. The Allies advanced like a flood, while the Germans were reduced to scattered groups of lost soldiers and burning tanks lining the roads. An American officer present at Falaise wrote in a letter, "We saw an army die not from wounds but from exhaustion. It was the most accurate observation of the Wehrmacht's condition. Death came not by bullets but through total depletion of fuel, ammunition, food, and faith. Resistance became meaningless." Von Schlieben's words at Cherbourg had become the collective voice of an entire army. When September arrived, Normandy turned to autumn. Grass grew over bomb craters, and the stench of burning faded into the wind. Yet in the memories of the survivors, the image of skies filled with planes, roads strewn with corpses, and the roar of burning tanks remained vivid. The Wehrmacht did not collapse in a single battle, but in thousands of small moments when each officer, each soldier realized that this war could no longer be won. They had fought to the very end, but before the might of global industry, every act of personal valor dissolved into meaninglessness. Normandy was not merely a military defeat, it was the end of the illusion that Germany could win a war through willpower alone. And when the guns finally fell silent, the empire that once believed in eternity found itself running out of time. As the smoke of Normandy faded, the survivors began to look back. For them, D-Day did not end with a simple victory or defeat, but with a new realization the modern war had become a product of industrial assembly lines. In a post-war report to the German General Staff in 1946, General Hans Speidel wrote, "Courage alone could not overcome industrial supremacy." He had witnessed the collapse of the command system in Normandy and understood that bravery, no matter how great, could not replace fuel, ammunition, and steel. In post-war hearings, Speidel stated, "We were still fighting the last war, while the Allies were already fighting the next one." That sentence became the most precise definition of the Wehrmacht's tragedy. On the 15th of July 1944, from his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon, Erwin Rommel sent a long report to Hitler. In it, he wrote, "The unequal struggle is nearing its end. The enemy's overwhelming superiority in men and material is beginning to tell. I must beg you to draw the necessary conclusions." 2 days later, when his command car was hit by a Spitfire, Rommel was severely wounded and forced to leave the battlefield. That letter was the final warning from a general who understood that Germany had lost not because of spirit, but because of an irreparable material disparity. According to the German Army Archive, this report is recognized as the first internal document acknowledging the failure of logistic parity. On a personal level, the surviving soldiers faced heavy memories. Hinrich Seel, the gunner at WN-62 who fired 13,500 rounds on June 6, wrote in his memoir, "My bullets meant nothing against their replacements." After the war, when he met an American veteran at a memorial ceremony, Seel told him in broken English, "We both fired until the barrels melted, but only one of us had more barrels." In his small room in Metzingen, he kept a spent shell casing beside a photo of his comrades. And every year on D-Day, he wrote a short line in his notebook, "Courage was never enough." According to the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, in 1944, American industrial output surpassed Germany's by 6 times, and its fuel transport capacity by 12 times. Each day, the Allies could move 15,000 tons of supplies across the English Channel, while the entire German force in northern France received less than 2,000 tons. That imbalance not only cost Germany the battlefield but also destroyed faith in its old philosophy of war. Friedrich von der Heydte, a former German paratroop commander, when interrogated in 1945, said, "We learned that modern war was an industrial process. We had soldiers, they had systems." In later years, German and American historians agreed that D-Day was the first proof of the industrialization of victory. According to the Allied Production Summary 1944, Ford, General Motors, and Boeing supplied over 40% of all equipment used by U.S. forces in the European campaign. More than 96,000 aircraft, 49,000 tanks, and 2.7 million trucks were delivered to the continent in just 1 year. Meanwhile, German industry, continuously bombed by the British and American air forces, lost over 70% of its production capacity by mid-1944. With no home front and no factories left, the Wehrmacht became an army severed from its lifeline. This reality forced German commanders to re-examine their entire military doctrine. Before the war, they had believed in Vernichtungsgedanke, the idea of swift annihilation through speed and skill. But at Normandy, speed meant nothing when every road was blocked, and skill could not stand against the firepower of thousands of ships and planes. In a report to the West German Defense Ministry in 1952, Speidel wrote, "The lesson of Normandy is that operational brilliance without logistical foundation leads only to heroic failure." Across the ocean, American officers reached the same conclusion. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his 1946 speech at West Point, said, "We did not win D-Day because our men were braver. We won because our factories never slept." The line echoed as a summary of the entire campaign. For the first time in history, Victory was defined not by tactics but by production capacity. In post-war halls, under the glare of interrogation lights, German generals repeated similar admissions. A Luftwaffe officer said, "The sky was no longer blue, it belonged to them." A former engineer of the TOT organization added, "We built walls, they built roads." Every statement, every reflection pointed in the same direction, the recognition that Germany had lost the moment it believed in the strength of static fortifications instead of the power of supply chains. 4 years later, at a military seminar in Bonn, Friedrich von der Heydte spoke before young Bundeswehr officers. The industrialization of warfare was not a tragedy for Germany alone. It was a warning to all nations that courage must be supported by capacity. That sentence would be quoted repeatedly in military textbooks as a reminder that every modern war is a race of productivity. Looking back at Normandy, historians call it the end of the age of heroism, not because soldiers were less brave, but because their bravery was drowned by the scale of global production. They manufactured victory on assembly lines, Speidel once wrote. And indeed, the assembly lines of Detroit reached all the way to Normandy's beaches, turning every bolt and barrel of oil into tools that shaped history. When Hinrich Seel died in 2005, a final note was found in his old notebook. "We fought for hours. They built for years." A simple sentence, yet it contained the entire truth of the 20th century that industry had defeated heroism, and war, from Normandy onward, had become the product of machines and output. Thank you for following the entire journey of D-Day from the German perspective, the war that logistics won. From the collapsing bunkers at Will 62 to the massive production engines in Detroit, this story is not merely about a battle, it is a reminder that history is written by those who organize, innovate, and learn from failure. Every number, every detail, stands as evidence that in modern warfare, courage must march alongside manufacturing power and industrial vision. The lessons of Normandy still echo today about the limits of human strength, the power of knowledge, and the cost of blind faith in power. We do not only look back at the past, we see how the modern world was built from it. Thank you for joining us through this documentary series. We remain committed to bringing you the most exceptional content, with absolute respect for history and those who lived it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of the battles that shaped the world.